When I was on that road trip for 30, I mean, people think I'm nuts. When I was on that road trip for 31 days, I was living in hotel rooms. I made those beds when I woke up in the morning. Okay. It's that one small thing change that I made that built a little bit of self-esteem in me that helped me make another, action that built a little bit more self-esteem and a little bit more self-respect and a little bit more self-confidence.
Stories are powerful.
Welcome to the Rise, Recover, Live podcast, brought to you by The Phoenix. This is a space where people impacted by substance use can come to share their story of strength and resilience, get open and honest, and inspire hope and build community through shared experience.
We'll be talking to people in our community on their own recovery journey and shine a light on the topic of recovery in all its forms. Maybe you'll hear some of your story in theirs.
Let's show the world that together we rise, recover, and live.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Rise, Recover, Live, the podcast. I am your host, Bryce III.
And I am your other host, Liz McKean.
And today we got a very special guest, someone who some of you may already know, and someone who some of you are about to get to know. Liz, why don't you introduce our guest today?
Yeah, man, this has been a long time coming, and it's taken some stops and starts with all of our schedules being busy. So I am just beyond thrilled to introduce Ryan Hampton, who is the founder of Mobilize Recovery. He is a person in recovery. He's also an advocate and an author. And we have been looking forward to this conversation for, I would say, months. So welcome, Ryan. Thank you for coming. How are you today?
I am really excited to be here, and I do apologize. It has taken months to get this. It's literally been start and go for us for the last...
on both ends. You can't take all the credit for that.
On both ends. But my gosh, I'm super excited to be here and super grateful for, the Phoenix and just the incredible partnership that we've had with Mobilize and the work that you all do in this podcast. And thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. And I think, so it's a few things that are on my mind immediately, right? So one is, fun fact for those listening and for Ryan, the first time me and Liz met in person was at Mobilize Recovery last year.
Really? I didn't know that. Oh my gosh. That's what I love. I love hearing stuff like that because that's really at the core. I mean, it mobilizes a lot of things, but at the core intention of it, it's a community. So that's awesome. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah. It was a landmark event. We was in Vegas, and a lot of things. I think it was just a pivotal season in my life. And then, I met Liz, and me and Liz hit it off, and it was just cool. And
before the podcast was even a seed. So yeah, it's pretty exciting.
And then two more things. So one, before I ask you one of my favorite questions, I noticed behind you, for those who are watching on YouTube, you have this pillow and it's got a doggy face on it. Can you please tell me the story about this doggy face pillow?
Oh my gosh. I might get a little emotional. That's Dollar. I got sober with him and he was my pit for 10 years. And my best friend, Garrett, who I'm going to his wedding on Saturday as his best man. We got him in 2012 and he was with us, on and off through recurrence abuse. But finally, when I got into recovery in 2014, got him back and he was with me, every big moment in my life. And he passed suddenly in July, which was one of the hardest things I've gone through. But Dollar, I still talk about him every chance I get. He's a conversation starter. That's why I got him there. But, he was a big part of my life, but a huge part of my own personal recovery journey. Best dog ever.
Incredible. Well, you got a big dog lover over here. Mine is laying right on the couch there. And before this one, we had Duncan for a lot of years, during a lot of the hard years too. And we lost him actually in July, the previous. And yeah, I give you so much credit for talking about it because it's hard for me to talk about it too. It's just one of the hardest things. And it's just a absolutely worth it cost of that love.
I've always said, like, I in a perfect world, right, for people who are like just entering this journey, I'm like, get them some life skills, get folks back on their feet, get them the housing they need, get them the wellness tools that they need, help them get a job, but also help them get a dog.
Heck yeah.
It's
Heck
such
yeah.
it was life-changing for me.
No,
Totally.
thanks for sharing that. Thanks for being transparent. And Dollar's energy lives on, especially through this pillow and on this podcast episode. That's wonderful. And so, third question is, how's your energy today?
It's good. My energy's so there's different parts of my energy, right? Like I think physically I'm tired because I just came off a 31-day, road trip essentially, and, with Mobilize Recovery and the bus. And, I'm still recouping from that. But I think my spiritual energy, and just where my head's at is in a really good spot. Like I'm hopeful and positive, and working on being a little bit more intentional with my sleep this week and next, because it was a little crazy while we were out there and we just got back. But it's good. It's good. It's solid.
So let's just jump right into it. For those who may not necessarily know what Mobilize Recovery, tell us a bit about Mobilize Recovery, what it is, what was the motivation behind getting it started up. And then last year, Liz and I met at it was a conference, and it was a one-off conference, and it was at a conference hall. And so, but this year you went on the road. So like you said, you went on a road trip. So tell us a bit about the origin of Mobilize Recovery and why the deviation from just the one event to a road trip this year.
Yeah, great question. So Mobilize Recovery, like I kind of mentioned at the beginning, at its core, it's a community for peer learning, peer support amongst advocates, people who are change makers in their communities, but also a place to learn, grow, and thrive, which I think is one of your taglines too, right? It was never intended to be something that happened every year. It's the first year we had it was in 2019, and it was the outcome of the Facebook Community Leadership Program, which I was a fellow to. And I remember, when I got into recovery in 2014, 2015 and 2016, I started kind of like finding my own footing in this orbit. Found that I really wanted to be more involved in the advocacy and community organizing aspect of ending overdose death and, supporting folks in recovery. And I was working for a nonprofit at the time. And I remember there were all these things I wanted to do, as an individual, not necessarily as a part of an organization, but as an individual in terms of, legislation or, getting folks in recovery registered to vote, or, getting folks in recovery more excited about maybe, serving on a local board or commission. And I came from a political background from way back when, pre-addiction days. And I was having a hard time finding a home for that work, some of the organizations I had worked with were really only kind of laser focused, as they should have been, like on their mission, their agenda, and not necessarily about how can we go out and build more leaders, to do what they're good at. How can we go out and help lead people to like what their purpose is to be on this planet, whether it's to be an advocate or, do a podcast or be involved in direct services or open a recovery house or run for elected office, as someone in recovery, or write a book, or, all these different things that folks wanted to do that I was seeing a need for. And I was at home, late 2018, I was on Facebook scrolling and saw this ad for this thing called the Facebook Community Leadership Program. And they were going to select 100 people from around the world through this highly competitive process who had ideas that could be really disruptive to solve one of the world's, larger global challenges. And on a whim, I just filled out the application, right? And I think I stayed up one night from like 11 p.m. to like 4 a.m. and like wrote this thing. And I called it Mobilize Recovery. And the idea was like, what if there was a home and we could just try it as a pilot for change makers in the recovery space, people who are looking for leadership skills, people who are wanting to kind of emerged with their own ideas and creations in their communities and gave them a home to learn from each other, what works, what doesn't work, bring in experts from outside the recovery space to try and help them build these ideas, and to be able to support one another. And, I went through this long process for about 6 months. There were 14,000 applications from around the world. 11 of them were selected in North America. The other ones were from in different countries, and Mobilize Recovery got selected. And I spent 1 year working with Facebook at their on and off at their office in Menlo Park to kind of fine tune what Mobilize Recovery would look like. They provided the first $50,000 to help get it off the ground, and we brought people together in July of 2019 for what was the first Mobilize. And there was an energy there that just felt different from things that I had done before and things that others had been involved in. There was a sense of mutual support around advocacy, which hadn't really existed, at least in my work previously in the space. And it was special, and the outcome of that was folks left and went home, and bills got passed and legislation got written and RCOs opened up, and, it grew into this network that, started coalitions in 41 different states, and, was reaching upwards of like 20,000 people that year through our direct actions. And then COVID hit, and we had to bring it online digitally. And that was the year, kind of oddly enough, I think started to expand, because we had people like Elton John and like Macklemore and others coming to us being like, how can we be involved in this thing called Mobilize Recovery? How can we support it? And it just grew from there, and it became an annual, convening. But, last year we did the event Recover Out Loud and Mobilize in Vegas, and it was an event. We really, when we thought about 2022, wanted to do something a little different and get back to our roots, which was, hey, not everybody can come to a, 3 days in Vegas. Not everyone, no matter, and not everyone has the same experience when you do digital. Like, what would it look like if we did all these mini kind of Mobilize Recovery experiences around the country? And that's kind of how the bus tour was born. And I think it really got us back to what our original intent was. Like, the intent, I hate it when people use the word conference. It's like when people are like, the Mobilize Recovery Conference, I'm like, that is the last thing I want it to be. That is the last thing I ever want it to become, is like a conference, because I think conferences are great and essential, but that's what they are. They're conferences, and people.
Well, yeah, and they're still not mobile. Yeah.
Right. They're not mobile, and they're still, and it's like, I want this to be seen as more of a community, and whether that takes the shape of a virtual event or an in-person event in Las Vegas or a bus tour or 50 different, homes for people around the country, or whether it's an idea that someone has to be a creator, that's what Mobilize Recovery is. So it's constantly evolving, and we're constantly responding to what the community needs, but it is different. And it has grown. And it's my hope that we see people come out of this experience and build something even bigger, right? Like, my goal is, I think a lot of the goals that many of us have is to be out of business someday. And I'm hoping that someone comes along and is like, I did Mobilize Recovery. I had this idea, and it's just going to blow the lights out on anything you've ever thought of or done before. And I'm like, take it and run with it. Like that's my hope. That's my hope.
Yeah. That's incredible. I've been thinking a lot about this within my own recovery, and then within the work that we're doing at the Phoenix. And it's just like highlighted so much in the work that you do at Mobilize in kind of like it's the wrong concept, but like similar, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs when it comes to recovery, and how, I feel like so often we all get caught up in like the foundation, which is, deeply important, and nothing else can happen until you've like just saved your own life, and you've gotten to the point that you can just continue to live and breathe and find yourself food and shelter and all those things. But then after that, I think sometimes people like get a little bit more lost because there hasn't been just structure, support or just even empowerment. It's almost been like, okay, save your own life. And now forever you're marked with this, you went through this. So it's just now that's who you are, instead of like, okay, cool. You've built that foundation. Now let's, continue to build that, but like go up to the next level where now let's like focus maybe a little more out on community. Maybe then now you get to like really find out what lights you up inside and combine that with, community. And then with Mobilize, it's like you're reaching like up and up in that pyramid of like, how can you really like self-actualize in a way that's not only going to change you, but it's going to change the world. And like, it's that empowerment. And that's like, it's like what Scott Strode always says, which is, folks that have experienced addiction are looked at as the problem, but we see them as the solution. And like, you are taking that and mobilizing it and like giving people that gift.
Well, I would, and it's not, I'd be mindful to say it's not me. I mean, it's like, it's just, it's an idea I had.
Your idea.
Yes. But like where this has ended up and what it's turned into is definitely not me. I mean, it's like incredible the amount of people that have been involved and have helped, bring this to fruition of where it is today. And, the other thing about Mobilize too, is it's, we have to figure out ways to give people an agency of hope, and that's been one of the big focuses too, is it's like, there is so much hope out there. Right. And like, I see it every day, and it's like, how do we bring people together to give them something to see and feel and participate in that they can hang on to, that gives them enough hope, to find that passion and to find that purpose and ignite that fire within them, to keep carrying it forward. Right. And I think that for my recovery capital, finding purpose, and finding passion beyond just my personal recovery program has been incredibly important, to my life story and my journey to where I'm at today. And that's something we're trying to create. And look, I think folks, even within the recovery community, even sometimes our biggest critics and enemies exist with, not enemies, but critics and stigma, I'll say, that we need to combat comes from like within our own community of recovery. And, at our heart, I think the majority of us, are creators. Like, I mean, just think about it, like the entrepreneurial spirit that exists within the recovery community, and the creativity and, whether it's music or art or business or politics or organizing or fitness, or, I mean, folks are creators, but the creators don't really have that, baseline home, and I think that's something that we're also trying to allow to flourish.
Yeah. I think in my personal experience, I have come across this energy sometimes where it's like recovery is such an intimate personal thing. So like what has worked for me, sometimes I've seen people become very protective of the way that they've recovered, and protective almost in a way of like, this is the way, this is the way to do it. Yeah, like my way is the only way. And maybe just recently in my own recovery, within the past 3-4 years, have I been exposed to like not only just multiple pathways of recovery, but these sort of incubators or environments where people can come and blossom in the ways that we contribute to recovery, our own personal recovery, as well as like recovery in general, like what it looks like to recover, like what that work looks like within the space. And I think these spaces are very important. And I think it allows for us to get outside of our boxes to see how we can help others, how we can tap into the work that can help others to recover, how we can contribute to the space. Because I really think also like we're still very early. Mm-hmm. We're still very early. I think an experience that I've had being somebody who's been in recovery for 9 years is that every day, like I'm talking about it because this has been my experience. So it's like, oh, everybody knows what this is. But really and truly, like in a whole, as a big picture, like this is still a very new conversation that we're having. There's still a lot of stigma that exists. There's still a lot of people who don't necessarily understand what this is. So to have like a playground where we can come flourish and allow for our ideas to go crazy around what it is that we feel that we can contribute to recovery, I think that's huge, man.
Well, I mean, just think about the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with, right?
Yeah.
And, one of my basic principles around it is like with a problem this big, you have to think out of the box and you have to have those big, bold ideas that nobody thinks are possible. And then you have to go and try and make it happen. Like I think one of the barriers that we've had in the movement, particularly is we've thought too small, historically. Like, I think it's like we've thought within the confines that were dealt to us, right? Like, here's, X amount of dollars in federal government funding. Here's where it needs to go. This is what recovery looks like. This is what treatment looks like. Do this, subscribe to this, and everything's going to be okay. Like, no, absolutely not. That's not how, that's one piece of a very large puzzle, but I think that we have underutilized the creativity and the ingenuity of the recovery community in the last couple of years, but that has changed, right? And the reason that has changed, and I've started to see it change, is because the dynamic of the community has changed as well. So like the dynamic and the diversity of individuals and thoughts and ideologies and talents and passion has changed. And we are letting folks start to create and lead, and as we do that more and start to let go of what this movement should look like to us or has looked like, we start to kind of, knock out of the park some of those big, bold, crazy ideas that nobody thought was possible.
Now I want to switch gears real quick. And so a big part of the recovery movement is our stories. Our stories are what empower us. When we learn to reframe our stories and use that to empower us versus to find shame in it, it allows for us to propel and make change in our lives and in other lives. So question number one, what are some of the most impactful stories that you have seen come out of Mobilize?
Oh, goodness. So this is like one of the things we do at Mobilize every year is just the power of public narrative. Like, how do we give people the tactics of like telling their own story, but also how their story connects to their community, and then what we're asking our community to do, and giving an audience a sense of where our values, our agency comes from. I found out early on in recovery that like, hey, for the most part, folks in recovery are really good at telling their stories, and we're usually really great at telling them in the what it was like, what happened, what it's like now, some sort of format like that. And not all the time does that format work in creating a sense of empathy with people who have no idea what recovery is about, And I think in sometimes when our stories are placed in the wrong forums and not with the right tactics, it actually sometimes can harm the movement more than help the movement. So like being very intentional with who, how, and where and what format you're sharing your story, I think is a new concept in the recovery movement. And it's helped us. So some of the most impactful stuff, I'm always like blown away. I usually hear about things months or years after they've happened. But we've seen people leave Mobilize and run for Congress. We've seen people leave Mobilize, and we had one guy that attended the first Mobilize in 2019. I didn't get the chance to meet him. I hadn't heard from him for a year and a half. He actually attended Mobilize he was in Las Vegas for something else. He was in recovery and just dropped by and stayed for 2 days and like was in the back of the room and nobody really knew he was there. Year and a half later, writes this letter to us about, how those 2 days changed his life. And he went back home to Illinois and started an RCO, and just got his first $750,000 in funding for it. I mean, it's stuff like that. It's hard to measure impact with things like this, because it's like, we don't have like this mechanism of like, okay, go home and report to us like we're a grant, every 3 months where you're at. Sometimes there's just a lag, and then you hear, these just incredible narratives of resilience and creativity. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is why we do this work, right? Because sometimes it's also easy. And I'm sure many of your listeners and you will relate to this, that you wake up on those days and you're like, the work isn't working. You feel like the work isn't working because you see the headlines, you hear the data, you get the calls, we get the calls, right? I mean, constantly, of friends of ours, people we love and are associated with who can't get into treatment, have died, family members that have lost, and it feels like the work isn't working. And then, you hear about my friend from Illinois, who's now like one of my best buddies, who, 2 years later, and this is what he's done with just 48 hours of time he spent with this community. And you're like, this is why I do this, and this is why we need to continue to do this, because sometimes we get so hung up on outcomes and measurements and capacity building and all this that it's hard to see the impact that's right in front of our eyes.
I was at this recovery summit, the Samson Recovery Summit, a couple of months ago, and while I was there, I'm a person with lived experience, and I do quite a bit of work, but there was still this imposter syndrome being in these rooms. I'm in here with CEOs, people who own RCOs and have started up things, and very data centric people as well. And somebody had spoke up and said, it's important for us to collect the data, and then they followed it up by saying, but stories are data. Stories are an indication of the impact of the work that we're doing. And so, hearing stories like this, like your friend from Illinois, like that is an indication of the way that it is working. I just had a light bulb moment too, like, because how do we measure those stories? How do we measure those impacts through the stories that are shared? So that's, I don't know. I think
I'll tell you another quick story. So I was in Minneapolis a couple of months ago, right before we left on the tour. And I was tired. I was out there visiting some RCOs, and new CDC data had just come out.
Ryan, sorry to interrupt you. Can you define RCOs? I'm not sure everybody listening is going to know what that term means.
Recovery Community Organization. It's a community-led and based nonprofit that provides peer support, essentially, for folks in or seeking recovery. And I was just having a down day, and I needed a haircut. It was like a Wednesday night. I needed a haircut. I had gotten done with my round of meetings sometime like around 6 p.m. There was an 8:30 p.m. haircut available up in uptown Minneapolis. So I booked it, went up there, got there. There were 3 barbers and nobody else in the barbershop. Went down, sat down. Barber starts, small talk with me. And I'm telling him I'm from Las Vegas and I'm visiting and yada, yada, yada. And about 5 minutes into the haircut, this kid just comes storming through the front door. And he must have been like 17 or 18 years old. He was all lit up you just see him glowing. He was so excited. And he sat down in the barber chair next to me, and the barber started cutting his hair, put the cape on, and asked him why he was so excited. And he just blurts out, because I'm going to Las Vegas tomorrow. And me being from Las Vegas, started immediately eavesdropping on this conversation, wasn't paying attention to a word that my barber was saying. And the kid proceeded to say, I am going to the EDC festival tomorrow. It's the first time I've been to which is this big electronica, festival that they have in the desert every year. Very well known that it's a lot of, drug use and alcohol and whatnot. And he's like, I'm going down there. I'm bringing my girlfriend. I can't wait. Parents are letting me go. And the barber's like, that's great, and he's cutting his hair. He's like, have you ever been before? Have you ever been to a festival before? And they're making small talk, and the barber stops him and it says, well, do you plan to check your drugs? And do you know what Narcan is? Mm-hmm. And the kid looks up at him and he's like, I think so. And without missing a beat, the barber says, hold on 1 second, goes over to his little table in his drawer where his scissors are, opens it up, pulls out a fentanyl test kit and Narcan nasal spray with a little pamphlet on how to use it, gives it to him, tells him to, just keep it just in case, and then goes right back to cutting his hair. And it was like as casual and non-judgmental and like just seamless as if he were asking him, hey, what'd you have for breakfast? And I left. I can get emotional sometimes, as you can see from the beginning of this podcast, but I left there like super emotional. Wow. And I thought to myself, these are the types of impact moments that you can't measure. These conversations and things like this are happening in small places like barbershops in different pockets around the country. And it was as if a miracle had happened, and it might have right there, but that would not have been possible or would have happened had it not have been for the years of work that many of us and people all around this country have done collectively in terms of how we talk about substance use, how we talk about harm reduction, how we talk about recovery, how we have normalized things like naloxone and fentanyl test strips, right? That's impact that'll never show up on a SAMHSA report or a federal government report. That's just stuff that's happening out there in the community. So it's like another one of those reminders of, when you don't think the work is working, it is working. Like it is going to take us some time to like get to a peak where we can see over it, right? But I can tell you stuff is happening, right? And we are light years further ahead of where we were just 3 years ago in terms of public attitudes and perceptions. Now our goal has to be to protect it and expand on it at all costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's actual numbers that are now potentially not going to happen, like that 17-year-old is, a number that we're not going to have to count, right. if the story had played out that way. And yeah, that's incredible. And it's in every single conversation. It's in this podcast. It's in the fact that like we can talk about this podcast, in our communities and to our families and things like that. It's the power of stories. And then it's also like that grain of salt with stories where we're so used to hearing, like you said, like what happened, how we fixed it and how we're all better now. And like knowing that it's just not linear like that it's not, a straight line. It's just not as simple as we would love for it to be.
So a lot of times in our own personal recovery, like we'll switch gears. We'll begin to do the opposite of what we've done before. And then we are okay with just like regaining our life and getting back on track. And not a lot of people are pulled to like start to do things that are bigger than them. So Ryan, I'm super interested about your own personal recovery story and how that led you to a point to where you felt like you needed to do more than just show up for your own personal recovery and do something bigger.
It's all part of, I think, my personal recovery in one way or another. It may not be a part of my personal quote unquote recovery program, but my recovery as a human being, I think it's all part of it. And it wasn't just, one moment. So like my story as an individual, right, is not too unique or uncommon, particularly around how I initiated, problematic and chaotic drug use and my journey to try and pull myself out of it, with the help of Medicaid and, a loving family and whatnot. Like it's not that unique. But honestly, when I first got sober in 2014 and 2015, like I had no intention of ever speaking the word addiction or recovery ever again in my life. Like my intention was get a car, drive Uber, live in a recovery house for a little bit, maybe get some sort of sales job. I was operating under the thought that I had ruined any type of like professional, ability to do anything in my life. That all my hopes and dreams were killed, and I was kind of reduced to just, existing for a while in early recovery. And honestly, I was miserable. I mean, people are, talk about a pink cloud. I can tell you, like the first 8 months of my recovery journey, I was miserable, like incredibly miserable and unhappy and uncomfortable. But I hung on, by a thread some days. Like I listened to other people and stayed embedded with a community, that could lift me up when I was having some of my worst days. And I remember very vividly, and for those who are like listening that are in recoveries, I usually can't share this story to like Congress because they'll think I'm crazy.
Oh shoot, Congress is our biggest listener.
But folks in recovery will appreciate this. I remember, about 8 months in, I kind of had a breakdown, and I was like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I want to live like this. Like I'm uncomfortable and I don't like it. And a fellow of mine, someone older than me and been around for a while and been around the block, said to me, "So what's your morning routine look like?" And I was like, "Well, I sleep till 10 or 11 because I don't really have a job. I drive when I want." He's like, "Well, what's your room look like in the sober living?" I'm like, "Well, I've almost gotten kicked out 3 times because it looks like a tornado went off in it, and he's like, "Well, why don't you just try one thing today or tomorrow?" At this point, he was like, "Why don't you wake up an hour earlier and before you leave the room, make your bed, just tidy things up a little bit and take it from there." And I'm like, "You're crazy." I'm like, "How is that going to make me feel any better or do anything or change my life or anything?" I thought he was nuts. And but I said, "Okay, I have nothing to lose. I'll do that." And I did it for a couple of days, and then it turned into a habit. And, from there it turned into, well, maybe I want to look for something else besides driving Uber. I remember I wanted to be public a little bit more about tell somebody my story. And I told my story, and then I wanted to write about my story. And I can tell you to this day, almost 8 years later, my bed is made first thing I do when I get out is I make that bed. When I was on that road trip for 30, I mean, people think I'm nuts. When I was on that road trip for 31 days, I was living in hotel rooms. I made those beds when I woke up in the morning. Okay. It's that one small thing change that I made that built a little bit of self-esteem in me that helped me make another, action that built a little bit more self-esteem and a little bit more self-respect and a little bit more self-confidence. And it's been a series, back to get back to for a very long-winded way of answering your question, of how does one end up in the place where you're building something like, or working on something like Mobilize or writing books or whatnot. It wasn't one moment. It was a series of hundreds of moments, that kind of strung themselves together that, lead me to the next step forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And such is recovery, such is the unfolding and evolving process of finding out the context into which we fit into this world, into society, into community, and into this work. And I know we're winding down on time, but before we get up out of here, I got a couple of questions from an audience, right? So question number 1, how do you maintain your own recovery and well-being as an activist?
I keep the two very separate. So I have an advocacy activist, writer, author, hat, and then my own personal recovery. I'll tell you, like I'm going to a wedding on Saturday, and a lot of my friends who I got sober with, who are my community, will be there, and I haven't seen some of them in quite some time. Ask them how many of them have read my book or follow Mobilize Recovery. They could care less. You know what I mean? I'm serious. Like they don't care. You know what I mean? And that's great. Like I have this world where it's just me and like the folks I got sober with, who I'm still very tight with today, and who are my community and my support. And I keep the two very separate. It's all part of who I am, and it's all part of my recovery journey. But I have to keep my personal recovery practices, at a distance from the work.
Now, what are some of the biggest challenges in having that separation? Like, is it a challenging thing to keep those things separated, especially as your name or Mobilize continues to get bigger and the work continues to spread further? Is it a challenge?
No, not necessarily. It could be a challenge in my own head, I think, but in practice, it's not really much of a challenge. I think it all comes down to like, you've got to keep yourself in a pretty steady place of humility, because where it becomes challenging is when your humility is out of check in your own personal recovery space. That's where it becomes challenging and dangerous. And so it's like you have to find a real balance in positive humility in both spaces. I think that's where the biggest danger I've seen, with a lot of folks who do this work and also are in recovery. It's when the humility gets out of check that things can kind of sometimes spiral out of control.
Okay. And question number 2, what is the most achievable policy win we are facing in addiction policy reform?
The most achieved, the 10% set aside, hands down. President's FY 2023 budget proposal has a 10% set aside for recovery support services, which would not match, but prevention gets a 20% set aside. A 10% set aside could mean hundreds of millions of dollars for recovery community organizations, recovery housing, peer recovery supports. And it could be a game changer for the infrastructure of recovery support services across the landscape. And we are almost there. I mean, it's, Congress has to eventually approve this budget request. It failed last year in FY22, but there's a lot of momentum for it in 2023. And it could be, it would be historic, but it would also be monumental, and direct community support to what I believe are our frontline workers in combating the overdose crisis.
Now, is there ways that the community can get involved to push for that reform?
Call your member of Congress and tell them to approve and to vote for and support the 10% set aside for recovery in the SAMHSA budget for 2023.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Wonderful.
We'll make sure to get that in the show notes.
Now we are going to close out with Liz's favorite special question.
I think it's your favorite special question, Bryce. Well, Ryan, this has been a really cool conversation because we've been able to hear about, you personally, and then also about the organization. And I really appreciate you being able to talk about those in a way that integrates them, but also does allow that separation. I think that's so critical to have, your own practices, so there's not like a hierarchy of the organization that you're working with versus like what you're doing for yourself, and having them both be important with your recovery first. So on the more personal level, like if you were able to get a message back to a previous version of you, it doesn't matter what previous version you choose, but there's some version of you out there listening to this podcast right now, what might that message be?
It would probably be that you're loved, no matter how you turn out, because I think that's where a lot of my trauma had come from, was just this self-loathing that I had for so long, particularly around like struggling with my sexual identity and other things in the 90s. And I saw myself as unlovable, so that would be something, and that it's going to be okay, that things are going to be okay. Childhood was not puppy dogs and sunshine for me growing up. So, I think that's what I would tell myself.
I love that. I think everybody needs to hear that. It's going to be okay. You are loved.
Yep. So, and such is the process of healing.
Yeah.
And it continues to look different as we grow and as we have more context into which we show up in our experience. And that's a beautiful message, I think, to any of us.
Definitely. Agreed. So Ryan, we'll definitely add in the show notes. We'll get some notes from you to put in there and links, but is there anywhere you would direct people to go to start if they want to learn more?
Yeah, check out recoveryvoices.com and mobilizerecovery.org. Get involved. Join us. We love folks coming over from the Phoenix and from podcasts, and there's room for everybody.
Amazing. Well, we're so grateful. Thank you for slicing out some time for this conversation. It was everything we'd hoped for and more. I know you're a very busy guy, so we just can't thank you enough. So it was a big pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
And we're really grateful for everyone who is listening. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe. If you'd be so kind to rate and review, it helps folks to find us. And this is a cool one. This is a little different than our episodes we've done so far. And we have a lot of really cool like resources and ideas and concepts that we haven't discussed a lot. So definitely, this is one to send to somebody. Send to somebody that you think would enjoy the conversation, who might want to learn more about Mobilize, or just know that this kind of stuff exists out in the world, and maybe they'll be inspired to come up with their version of Mobilize tonight between the hours of 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. You never know. Well, thanks, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
So now you're excited. Bryce, Liz, how do I get involved with the Phoenix? Well, my friend, it is super simple. We actually have an app. Head over to the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store, or look in the show notes of this podcast, wherever you're listening to or watching this podcast, and go download the Phoenix app.
The Phoenix app makes it so easy to find classes that are near you, or to access our virtual class schedule where you can hop on from the comfort of your home. You can also join our groups and have a conversation with someone from the Phoenix community from anywhere in the world. Please make sure that you join the podcast group where you can connect with Bryce and I and other listeners. Everything that you need is in the show notes. You can also head to our website at www.thephoenix.org. And maybe while you're there, you click the volunteer tab and get even more involved.